we're going to review the fate of the Cherokee Indians. We told you yesterday that the Cherokee tribe was very organized and civilized in their own way. Rhiannon, give me one example of that. They had their own written language. Nick, how about another example of their organization and how they became civilized?
They published their own newspapers.
In their own language. Rachel, how about another one?
They built and supported schools for their children.
Very good. And the last one, Aaron?
They had developed a constitution with laws and law enforcement officers and the judiciary system.
Yeah, I mean, they were very well organized. And again, their point was, if we get ourselves civilized and organized sort of like the white man, they'll let us stay in our land in Georgia and not make us move west. Well, what happened that threw that kink in that whole thing there, Laramie? What happened? What caused them issues, even though they were very well organized and civilized?
A gold rush in Georgia.
They had a gold rush. They discovered gold on Cherokee land in Georgia, and white settlers wished to swarm in and pick up that gold. So, Emily, what did the government of Georgia first try to get the tribe to do first when gold was discovered? Well, how though? What were they going to need to do to leave?
Tree.
No. Well, kind of, but they tried to get him to do what? What did they try to get him to do? David?
Try to take their land.
Not yet. What did they try to do first, Kyra?
They asked them to sign the
The removal. They asked him to sign the removal treaty, and they refused to do that. So when they refused to do that, the government threatened just to seize their lands anyway. So Naya, what did the Cherokee tribe do to try to get rid of this illegal seizure of their land? What's that? Which court? The biggest one in the land. They pled their case to the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall, and he was going to rule whether the state of Georgia had jurisdiction over the tribe to take their lands or not. What did he rule, Aurora?
He said that Georgia had no right to seize the Indian land.
Absolutely. And so government officials in Georgia just accepted that, right, Peyton? No, they did not. They decided to ignore it and continued their actions against the Cherokee tribe, so it ended up on the desk basically of President Jackson, who believed in the power of the presidency, and he also refused to enforce the Supreme Court ruling stating, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Well, despite the Supreme Court ruling in their favor, most Cherokee leaders figured it was a no-win situation. So finally in 1835, the Cherokee leaders agreed to sign the removal treaty in exchange for being relocated peacefully. Now this treaty was called the Treaty of New Echota, and those Cherokee leaders that signed those agreements were able to move west of the Mississippi peacefully. However, there was a lone holdout, that was Cherokee Chief John Ross. He resisted the Removal Act until the bitter end, and as a result, approximately 20,000 resistant Cherokees, men, women, and children under the leadership of John Ross were relocated westward by force at gunpoint in the middle of the winter. I believe that's where we ended yesterday, right? Well, by the time that this relocation was completed, over 25% of those 20,000 men, women, and children perished along the route. More than 25% of those Cherokee Indians under the leadership of John Ross perished during this relocation. And this sad march became known in American history as the Trail of Tears. Okay? Now, I want you to make sure you get this down. According to Indian legend, a flower of sadness grew in every spot a tear fell on the Trail of Tears. According to Indian legend, a flower of sadness grew in every spot that a tear fell on the Trail of Tears. One more time. according to Indian legend, a flower of sadness grew in every spot a tear fell on the Trail of Tears. Does anybody happen to know what the state flower of Georgia is? Anybody know what that is? Here it is. The Cherokee rose. And if you follow the Trail of Tears historically, you see growing all along the trail the Cherokee rose. And so according to Indian legend, every time a tear was dropped on the Trail of Tears, a flower of sadness grew. This is the flower of sadness they're referring to. Obviously it's Indian legend. But the Cherokee rose became the state flower of Georgia. Okay, now we'll talk about the fate of the Seminole Indians in Florida, because they were the other Indian tribe that made the decision not to sign relocation agreements and be moved peaceably west of the Mississippi. The fate of the Seminole Indians. Now this was a little bit different because it was similar to the Sauk and Fox Indians. The failure of the Seminole Indians to sign those agreements led to what we know as the Seminole War. And that was between the Seminole Indians and the military. Very similar to what we faced up in Illinois and Wisconsin with the Sauk and Fox Indians. So there was a war that lasted until 1842 between the United States military and the Seminole Indians. Finally, as similar in the other war, the Seminoles were defeated by the American military, and after their defeat, they peacefully moved west of the Mississippi. So, the fate of the Seminole Indians of Florida, failure of the Seminole Indians to sign agreements led to the Seminole War between the Indians and the military. The Seminole War lasted until 1842 when the Seminoles were finally defeated by the American military, and after their defeat, the Seminoles peacefully moved westward, with the exception of a small number of Seminole Indians who fled and hid in the Florida Everglades. They went and hid in the Florida Everglades, and their descendants still live in the Florida Everglades today. So the generations continue from 1842 to the present. There are still descendants of those Seminole Indians who fled in 1842 to the Everglades, still in Florida today. Okay, any questions on that? Alrighty, that's going to get back to politics, and we're going to talk about President Jackson's opposition to the Bank of the United States. President Jackson's opposition to the Bank of the United States. Now, first of all, I just want to make a point that one of the most bitter fights that Jackson fought during his presidency was against the Bank of the United States. He was very much against it. He saw it as a thorn in his side. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why he attacked the Bank of the United States. 3 reasons why Jackson attacked the Bank of the United States. Number 1, he disliked and distrusted banks. He disliked and distrusted banks. Which will kind of lead us to the second reason he went after the Bank of the United States. So Porter, if you dislike and distrust something, what's a good chance that you might not? Why would you distrust or dislike it? Because you don't? Why might you distrust or dislike something? Some people distrust and dislike Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Why do they dislike or distrust that? Or they don't understand it. And that's the second reason why Jackson went after the Bank of the United States, is he simply didn't understand the banking system at all. And as a result of not understanding the banking system, he distrusted it and disliked it. That's very common. People say they often don't like things or they don't trust things because they just don't get it. They don't understand it. Okay? But the third reason why he attacked the Bank of the United States might be the most important. What did he see the Bank of the United States as? As what? Well, kind of, but who invested in the Bank of the United States? Who were the stockholders?
Federalists?
Rich Federalists or rich people. And he saw the Bank of the United States as simply a monopoly that rich people used to their advantage. It wasn't doing anything in his mind to the common person. Most of the stockholders that owned stock in the Bank of the United States were from the eastern seaboard and were rich. Now, I'm not saying there weren't a few rich people in the west, lands west of the Appalachians. They had a few stockholders west of the Appalachians that would be more considered common folk that had stocks, but most of the stock members, the people that owned the bank, were from the eastern seaboard and they were wealthy. He actually referred to the Bank of the United States as a money power. If you had money, you had the power. And he did not see it as any advantage at all for the common person. And that's another reason why he went after the bank, is because he saw it as simply a monopoly that rich and powerful people used to their own advantage. He even went as far as to accuse the Bank of the United States of lending money to Congress in exchange for political favors. He thought it was corrupt. He thought that they would lend money to members of Congress in turn for Congress passing laws or doing things that would favor the bank. He really saw it as a bad deal. Matter of fact, if you sum it up, he simply thought the mere existence of the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional. He didn't believe it. He believed it violated the Constitution of the United States. So he had no use at all for the Bank of the United States for many reasons, and his viewpoints were simply it isn't even constitutional. Now, if you were the Bank of the United States and you saw Jackson coming after you, what would you do to make sure that the bank continued, despite his opposition, taking into consideration what we talked about, what happened to the first national bank? Why did the first national bank go down the tubes? We remember that? Because what didn't they renew? They didn't renew the charter or the lease. Remember that? Remember we talked about that's why when they started the Second National Bank, the reason the first one went out of business, so to speak, because Congress didn't pass a bill to renew the lease. Well, here's the Bank of the United States whose lease is about to come up in 1832, and what are they thinking? Man, we better get this thing done. So they petition, and Congress passes a bill that gives them their new lease for the next 4 years. Because every 4 years you had to renew it. So as soon as the Bank of the United States could see that Jackson was kind of going to go after them, they went to Congress to assure that they got their lease, which was required every 4 years. Well, it's a bill, and what does the president have the right to do to a bill?
Veto it.
Veto it, and that's what President Jackson did. He vetoed this bill that gave the Bank of the United States their additional 4-year charter. Now, if he vetoes it, does that mean it doesn't go into effect? No, it just means that the president is against the bill that Congress put across. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So it actually happened, okay? Well, because of the fact that the bank was given another charter for 4 years, it's going to be a huge campaign issue in the election of 1832, which is coming up. One of the biggest discussions in that election is going to be whether the Bank of the United States is legitimate or not. So because of the actions of Andrew Jackson and what the Bank of the United States did, including what Congress did, this becomes a big issue in the election of 1832, which we are going to talk about next. The election of 1832. Jackson served his first term. Okay, so what two political parties do we have now? Oh, the Federalists are long gone. Democrats and Republicans. They were the National Republicans and the Democratic Republicans, because remember Jackson split off from the Republican Party, and now we just call them Republicans and Democrats, okay? Now, who do you think is going to be the Republican nominee for president? He's hadn't had a lot to do too much lately. Who? Come on, who's our man?
Clay?
Yes, Henry Clay. Henry Clay is going to run for the Republican Party for president. He served as Secretary of State. and then didn't get his shot at the presidency like every other Secretary of State did when Jackson won, so now he's going to try to get elected to his own presidency. And is he going to campaign in favor or against the Bank of the United States?
Favor.
Absolutely in favor. So he's going to have all the rich people's votes. Well, running for the Democrats will be Jackson for re-election for president, and then Martin Van Buren of New York will run with Jackson as his vice president. So for the Democrats, it'll be Andrew Jackson for re-election and Martin Van Buren for vice president. Does Jackson run for or against the Bank of the United States? Obviously against. Who controls the vote? The common people or the rich people? Common people. So guess what happens? Jackson wins a landslide. Of the 268 possible electoral votes, Jackson gets 219. Of the 268 possible electoral votes, Andrew Jackson gets 219 and is re-elected President of the United States, and Clay and the Republican Party suffer another crushing defeat. So what do you think Jackson's going to do? What's his first priority after getting re-elected? That would be the next subtopic, which is destroying the Bank of the United States. So that's what his next plan is. So he's re-elected, and now his first order of business is going to be to destroy the Bank of the United States. All right, anybody in here got a banker in the family?
My mom.
Last period I had, okay, yeah, she's right here. So, Peyton's dad runs the Pinnacle Bank here. If I want to destroy the Pinnacle Bank, and I'm the richest man in Worland, what do I do?
Marry his daughter.
Well, that might destroy the bank, all right, because I know Gil McHenry. You're going to have to go through a screening process to get in that business. Yes?
Buy out the stocks.
Well, you might want to buy out the stocks, but the problem is I've got all kinds of money in that bank. So I'm already got a lot of money in that bank. Because who's got a lot of money in the Bank of the United States?
Rich people.
The federal, well, rich people do, but the federal government does, doesn't it? Because isn't that where we're putting all of our money? So the Bank of the United States, you both made good points. The Bank of the United States has these stockholders' money, no doubt, but it also has all the federal money, okay, that we collect from taxes. So how am I going to run Gil McHenry out of business?
Take away the federal money.
I'm going to take all the federal money out of his bank, because I can do that, right? And where am I going to put that money?
The states.
I'm going to put it in certain state banks called pet banks. I'm going to gradually withdraw. How long of a lease do they have? They just passed it.
4 years.
4 years. And so now what I'm going to do is over that 4-year period of time, I'm going to gradually take that federal money out of that bank, and I'm going to put it in these state banks or pet banks. Why do they call them, Naya, pet banks? Because you're kind of the teacher's pet in this class, aren't you? Well, you should be. How would you become the teacher's pet? Be really nice to me, be loyal to me, and I really like you and think you were awesome, which I do anyway. So why are these banks called pet banks and he's putting these money in? Because they're very nice and loyal to Andrew Jackson. So that's what he does. He pulls all this money, this federal money over a period of time, out of the Bank of the United States, and he puts them in certain state banks referred to as pet banks because they were all loyal to President Jackson. Now, I just want you to know and everybody else know it's okay to be my favorite. You're all my favorites. It's okay to be good. Okay? Now, what Jackson did is he just watched the bank get weaker and weaker and weaker, and when the 4-year lease came up and Congress had to grant them another charter, could they do that if they weren't functioning well? No, so they didn't. And that's how Jackson destroyed the Bank of the United States. He simply made it so weak by the time the lease was up, Congress did not renew, and in 1836 the Bank of the United States closed. Bank of the United States closed. So he did destroy the Bank of the United States. Any questions on that? 1836. Yep. Renewed in 1832. The 4-year lease ran out. It was in such poor shape they could not renew. Well, that'll take us to the election of 1836, and the end of the Jacksonian era. The election of 1836 and the end of the Jacksonian era. I'll tell you a little story prior to this election, kind of interesting. In January of 1835, okay, President Jackson was visiting the Capitol. And a deranged house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence approached the president, pointed his pistol at him, and fired. In January of 1835, President Jackson was visiting the Capitol, and a deranged house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence approached President Jackson, pointed his pistol at him, and fired. The pistol misfired, so Lawrence pulled another pistol out and shot at Jackson with the other pistol, and it also misfired. True story. So, in January of 1835, Jackson's visiting the Capitol. A deranged house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence approached the president, points his pistol at him and fires. The pistol misfires, so Lawrence pulls out a second pistol, shoots at Jackson again with his other pistol, which also misfires. Jackson was so angry with the assassination attempt, he pulled out his cane and went after Lawrence with it. And he had to be restrained by members of his staff. He was so mad. That is Andrew Jackson. The guy tries to shoot him twice and fails, and he's so mad about it that he takes his cane and goes after this guy with his cane, and his staff has to stop him. Well, President Jackson survived a lot of crazy stuff, and he decided, well, I should